So yesterday we were talking about the Kohanim eating the remnants of the mincha and the sin offerings and the guilt offerings and the other korbanos. And now we have, that is, that he commanded to burn consecrated items that have become impure. So let's say you have meat from a sacrifice and it has become impure. So what are you supposed to do with it? And that is his saying, meat that touches anything impure shall be burned in fire. And in the Gemara, in Shabbos, it comes to explain the reason for that which it is forbidden to kindle priestly tithe of oil that has become impure on a holiday. And they said about this Shabbaton. It is a positive commandment such that rest from work on the holiday is a positive commandment and a negative commandment. And a positive commandment does not push off a negative commandment and a positive commandment. So even though you are supposed to burn the oil that became impure, you can't do it on a holiday, because burning something on a holiday that is not part of food, that you're not eating, is a violation of both a positive and negative commandment. And even though you have a mitzvah to burn this oil that was truma but became impure, it's a mitzvah to burn it, as he had just said before, but you can't do it on a Yom Tov because the Yom Tov supersedes it. Again, he's trying to demonstrate that this is a mitzvah, so he's showing us one of the places where that is discussed. So it's called a positive commandment. That is the commandment to burn something that had been sanctified that then became impure. It's a positive commandment. And you see from here that a positive commandment doesn't push off a positive and negative commandment. Again, he's not trying to talk to us about how that works. We have a principle that a positive commandment does override a negative commandment, but that's only when it's a regular negative commandment. He just wants us to see that it's a positive commandment. Why is it that a positive commandment would overcome a negative commandment? So again, we mean the assumption is that when we have a positive commandment, God is instructing us on how to live this life that we have. We're put on this earth for a limited period of time, and we could ask ourselves, what are we supposed to do about it? And so we could check out the Torah. The Torah has lists of things for us to do, and we might occupy ourselves with the things that it suggests doing in the Torah, because again, we can assume that's advice on how to spend our time while we're alive. Even if you would spend your time following the various mitzvahs in the Torah, you're going to find that you have free time in between doing those mitzvahs. It seems like that free time is left to us to decide how to spend, as long as we don't transgress the negative commandments that are mentioned. So if you had that attitude, and you made that assumption about the Torah, so you might feel like the positive commandments are more directly connected to our purpose for being. The negative commandments are just keeping us away from harm. But if we're looking for a sense of direction, if we're trying to understand purpose, it would make sense to look towards a positive commandment. So that's how some people understand why it is that if you have a positive commandment that comes together with a negative commandment, the principle is the positive commandment overrides the negative commandment. You've got to follow one or the other. And since the one, the positive commandment, might be more directly connected with how God wants us to live, so we could see why it would dominate if it was head to head with negative commandments. It doesn't have to be that way, but there are those who suggest that that's the reason. So regularly, it is true, a positive commandment override a negative commandment. Since it's a positive commandment to burn sanctified material that's come in contact with tuma, with impurity, you might think that you would burn the truma that became defiled even on Yom Tov. So this is coming to tell you, yeah, that's only when it's a positive commandment against a negative commandment. But if you have both a positive and a negative commandment on the other side, then the positive commandment doesn't override it. So on Yom Tov, you have both a positive commandment to experience Yom Tov, and you have a negative commandment against destructive acts that are not connected to making food. And there you have it. And the content of this statement is that doing work on holidays is forbidden, and one who does it transgresses a positive commandment, since work is the negation of a positive commandment. And that is his maybe exalted saying about the holiday, it shall be a Shabbaton for you. So it's stated in a positive way. You shall rest on this day from creative work, positive commandment. He also transgresses a negative commandment, since he is doing what has been forbidden to him, and that is saying no work shall be done. So on holidays, we're told both to rest from creative work and to not do creative work. One is expressed as a positive commandment, one is expressed as a negative commandment, meaning on the holidays, whereas the burning of consecrated items is a positive commandment, hence it is not permitted to burn it on a holiday on account of the principle that is mentioned. A positive commandment does not push off a negative commandment and a positive commandment. And there, they also said, just like it is a commandment to burn consecrated items that have become impure, so too is a commandment to burn priestly tithes of oil that have become impure. Again, he is mostly just interested in showing us that burning sacred items that became impure is a positive commandment. He's showing us because that's how they talk about it over there in that discussion about overriding the holiday laws. The laws of this commandment have already been explained in Psachim and at the end of Tamura. And there we have it. So that is mitzvah 90. And that was the mitzvah to burn sacred objects that came in contact with the impure. Now, there's another burning mitzvah, and that is that he commanded us to burn leftovers. You would think that leftovers should be eaten so that we do not waste sanctified material. And although that might be true within the proper time frame, yesterday, David and I were having this conversation about whether or not it's actually a mitzvah to make sure that there aren't leftovers. But let's say there are. Let's say there are leftovers. There's a time frame in which you have to eat this sacred material, and now you're past that time frame. So if it was a Korban Pesach, technically the rule with the Korban Pesach is you offer the sacrifice on the 14th during the day. Let's say the 14th during the day is a Sunday. So on Sunday at around noon, let's say 12:30, you are standing on line with your lamb, and the lamb is slaughtered, the blood is taken, sprinkled on the altar. Some of the innards are taken, burnt on the altar, and the rest is given back to you. And you and your cousin perhaps have some kind of a stick, and you have your lamb hanging from the stick, and you bring it back home to where your family is. It's going to be roasted over a fire and served at the Seder night. Let's say that there's some extra from this lamb. You technically could still finish it up till first light that next morning, because technically the way it works with the Pesach offering and certain other offerings is you have the rest of the day, then you have that night all the way through the night till first light. But the rabbis, concerned that you may wait till the last minute, ended up moving up the deadline to midnight. So at midnight, you are no longer able to eat from the Korban Pesach. It's called what we'll say are halachic leftovers. And halachic leftovers are forbidden to eat. They are called notar, that which is left over. Once something gets the status of halachic leftovers, they have to be burnt, as we're reading right now. So with the Korban Pesach, it would be by midnight that first night. Some other offerings, like a peace offering, it may not be until the next day. So you could have leftovers for breakfast, you could have leftovers for lunch, but once it gets to nightfall, then you can't have any more leftovers, and it becomes halachic leftovers even for a peace offering. So that is that he commanded to burn the leftovers, and that is, he may be saying, what is left over of the meat of the sacrifice shall be burned. And in explanation of his also saying about the Pesach lamb, you shall not leave over from it. They said in the Mechilta, it comes to give a positive commandment and a negative commandment. And in many places, in Psachim and Makos and other places besides them, it says an explanation that it is a negative commandment that is rectified by a positive commandment. So you're not supposed to leave leftover, but if you do, burn it. And therefore, we do not receive lashes for it. And the positive commandment is which you mentioned, what is left over from it, you shall burn. Now, yesterday, David, this was what David was asking, is there a mitzvah to eat the whole thing, to make sure that it is eaten? From this commandment, it sounds like there is. It's just that if you didn't, you can fix that by burning what was left. But it does seem from this that there is a negative commandment to leave stuff over. That's what it seems like. There's a negative commandment to leave stuff over, but if you do, you can fix that by burning it. And what is left over from it, you shall burn. And the law of leftovers and improper, which is pigul sacrifices, is the same, as I'll explain in negative commandment number 132. For the improper has already been referred to by the expression leftovers. The improper, what he's referring to here as improper, is the Hebrew word pigul. Pigul means that you had the wrong intent when the offering was brought. When the offering was brought, he intended to eat it either at the wrong time or in the wrong place. These laws, pigul and nosar, are often put together, and that's what he's saying over here. The laws of the commandment have already been explained in Tractate Psachim and the end of Tamura. See Parshat Tzav. All right, so it does seem from here, from the language here, the way the Rambam treats it, that let's say you're at the Pesach Seder and people are saying, come on, you guys, we have to finish the Korban Pesach before halachic midnight, that there really should be a push to finish the Korban Pesach, all the meat of the Korban Pesach. And then if they technically don't accomplish it, then they would burn it. But it does look like from here that you are supposed to make every effort to eat it. Now, is that, yesterday we were talking about, is that a mitzvah for the individual, or is it a mitzvah for the group? So in other words, does the family have to make sure that the Korban Pesach was eaten, or does each individual have to make sure that the Korban Pesach is eaten? So in other words, it could be that the goal is just to make sure it's eaten, but I don't have to be the one who ate it. I have to eat a kazayis, I have to eat an olive size, but let's say there's like 2 pounds of the Korban Pesach left. And do I have to eat as much as possible till I get sick to finish it off because it's not finished off? Or do I just have to make sure that somebody is eating it, or a few people are eating it, but I don't necessarily have to be the one to do it. From here, it's not easy to tell which it is, but it does seem here like it is wrong to leave it over. Okay, now we're bopping all around on offerings, and
so Rabbi, one last thing. You said so on the Passover on the Passover one, if they don't finish it by a certain time, they are allowed to burn it, or they're not allowed to burn it.
They have to burn it.
Right.
They have
to. Is there come a time where they're not allowed to burn it, or no?
No.
All right.
No. That is that he commanded us that a Nazirite shall grow his hair. So in the midst of all the sacrificial stuff, we are seeing the mitzvah for a Nazir to grow his hair. The Nazir is a person who's going to bring sacrifices, and his hair is going to be part of the offering that he brings, because eventually he cuts his hair and puts it under the pot that is cooking his offering. So even if this isn't a direct law about sacrifice, but it's in the ballpark because a Nazir is subject to sacrifice. But first, just the rule that a Nazirite shall grow his hair. And that is, may he be blessed, saying, he shall let grow untrimmed the hair of his head. And the language of the Mechilta is, he shall be holy, its growth is to be in holiness, and he shall let it grow untrimmed. It's a positive commandment, and from where do we know that this is also a negative commandment? Hence, we learn to say, no razor shall touch his head. And it is said there, this is what I have given as a positive commandment only, one who scrubs his scalp with earth and one who places herbs. Meaning, when a Nazirite puts them on his head to remove the hair, he would not be transgressing the negative commandment, because the negative commandment is that you shouldn't cut your hair with a razor. So he's gotten around the negative commandment, but he did transgress the positive commandment, which is he's supposed to let his hair grow untrimmed. And this one didn't grow his hair. So let's say he had a product that was something like Nair, some kind of a version of Nair, which is a cream that goes on your body and removes hair. So if he had developed some kind of cream that would remove hair, and he would just put the cream, let's say, on his head, and that would remove all the hair from his head, even though he technically is not transgressing the negative commandment of cutting his hair with a razor, but he has not fulfilled the positive commandment of letting his hair grow. So Nazir is not so much about not cutting his hair as it is about growing his hair. That one of the signature features of a Nazir is that he has long hair. As a negative commandment derived from a positive commandment is a positive commandment, that is a principle with us. So even though this principle is connected with the negative commandment, this is still a positive commandment, growing his hair. That's why it's being listed as mitzvah 93, that the Nazir should grow his hair. The laws of this commandment have already been explained in tractate Nazir. So I once looked up while Lois and Estelle and I were learning about the Nazir not that long ago in our Chumash class. I was researching whether or not the Christian monks found inspiration from the Nazir to become, in other words, is their model for being a monk a kind of hermit or ascetic, a lone devotee to God? Was that inspired by the Nazir? And I couldn't find any connection. I even engaged Chat GPT with this, and it came back empty. Its response, I will say its response is, let's see here. Yeah, so did you find any sources that indicate that the Catholic month was inspired by the Jewish Nazir? While there is no direct evidence to suggest that Catholic monks were specifically inspired by the Jewish Nazir, it is possible to draw some parallels and influence between the two practices. It's important to note that monasticism emerged in the early centuries of Christianity and was influenced by Jewish religious practice, including asceticism and separation for the purpose of devotion. Now that might be more like the Essenes or people like that. Early Christian ascetics sought to imitate the lifestyle of Jesus and his disciples, who practiced detachment from worldly possessions and focused on spiritual pursuits. This asceticism can be seen as a broader continuity with certain aspects of Jewish traditions, including the Nazarite vow. However, it is difficult to establish a direct line of influence from the Nazarite vow to the development of Catholic monasticism. Catholic monasticism, as it evolved over time, incorporated elements from various sources, including the teachings of Jesus, early Christian communities, Greek philosophy, Roman ascetic traditions. The primary influence on Catholic monasticism can be traced to figures like Saint Anthony of Egypt and Saint Benedict of Nursia, whose writings and examples shared the monastic movement in the Christian West. So it's let's just say ChatGPT wasn't enthusiastic about any connection here, because my assumption was that while the Nazir has a couple of specific commandments, they might be more of a symbol of his decision to withdraw to some degree from polite society to devote himself or herself entirely to the service of God, and then it might be something similar to a monastic, but no such luck. Okay, that is that he commanded us to shave the Nazarite's head. This is commandment number 93. That is, he commanded us to shave the Nazarite's head and to bring his sacrifices at the culmination of his Nazariteship. The language of the Sifra is 3 shave, and their shaving is a commandment: the Nazarite, the Mitzvot, and the Levites. However, the shaving of the Levites was in the Sinai desert. In other words, it only happened once and not for all generations. Whereas the shaving of the Mitzvot, which is the person with Tzora'at, and the Nazarite is practiced for all generations. And it is explained that there are 2 shavings for the Nazarite: a shaving of impurity, which would mean that while he was a Nazir, he came in contact with the dead, which is something he wasn't supposed to do, but he did. And so once that happens, he has to sort of start over. So he shaves his head as part of that, because he's going to start over and start growing his hair once again for his Nazariteship. A shaving of impurity and a shaving of purity. So if he didn't come in contact with the dead and has just come to the end of his Nazariteship, because a Nazir could be a Nazir for as little as 1 month. In fact, apparently that was the assumption, that he's a Nazarite, or he or she are a Nazarite for 1 month. Let's say they didn't come in contact with any dead and they're just finished with their month, they also shave their head. And that is his saying on the day that his term as Nazarite is completed. And it is inappropriate to count the 2 shavings as 2 separate commandments, for the shaving of impurity is one of the laws of the commandment of Nazariteship. For this commandment is to grow his hair untrimmed in purity, as that verse explained and taught about this. So if his Nazariteship became impure, he shaves and brings a sacrifice, and then he returns to growing it untrimmed in holiness, as at the beginning, for the number of days that he obligated himself. It is like the Mitzvot that also has 2 shavings, yet that is one commandment, as I will explain in its place, Positive Commandment 111. I will also explain the reason for our counting the shaving of the Nazarite and the sacrifice as one commandment. So at some point you're going to see that his shaving and bringing the sacrifices is all one commandment. The shaving of the Metzora and his sacrifice are two commandments. The regulations of this commandment, meaning the shaving of the Nazirite, have also been explained in their place. This is to such a degree that the shaving and the offerings, they go together, that oftentimes in the Gemara, it would just speak of the Nazirite shaving his hair, and it was understood that they meant bringing offerings. It became like a euphemism for bringing offerings. He shaved his head.
Rabbi, can we?
I lost you there, Sam.
I'm a little lost. I'm more than lost on the phone, but I'm a little lost on what you're discussing. For some reason.
All right,
Can you simplify it a little bit?
We are listing the positive commandments out of the 613.
Right.
We are in positive commandment 93. In positive commandment 92, we said that a Nazirite has to grow his hair. In positive commandment 93, we are saying that the positive commandment that the Nazir has to now shave his hair. He grew his hair at the beginning of being a Nazir, and he shaves his hair when he completes being a Nazir.
Right.
That's it.
I understand that.
Number 94, that is that we were commanded to fulfill everything that we take upon ourselves in speech, whether it's an oath, a vow of charity, a sacrifice, or anything else besides them. So this is the positive commandment to follow through on our commitments. Whether you made it as a shvua or a neder, or you said it as a tzedakah or a korban, you committed yourself, you're supposed to follow through. And that's a positive commandment. And that is his may be exalted saying, what issues from your lips, you shall observe. In Hebrew, motzei svasecha tishmor, what comes out of your mouth, you shall do. And even though they've already separated the words of this verse and arranged each word for various content, the intention that nevertheless comes out of this is that what they're saying to you is that it's a positive commandment to fulfill everything that he accepts upon himself, whatever that be. In other words, again, doesn't matter if you did it as a shvua, as a neder, as a korban, anything that you committed yourself to doing, you have to follow through on doing. And one who violates it also violates a negative commandment. And behold, I shall explain this in my mention, the negative commandments, 157. And in the Sifrei, what issues from your lips is a positive commandment. And you know that there is no content to the statement, what issues alone. However, the intention is that, which I mentioned to you, to understand the simple meaning of the verse, that he commanded to do what one puts out with his mouth. And behold, that this commandment is repeated, and that is saying, according to all the issues from the south shall you do, in Numbers. The regulations of the commandment have also been explained in many places, in Shavuos, at the end of Menachos, and the Tractate Kingdom as well. That is to say, the specifics of concerning oneself to do the thing that one has obligated himself, and how one exempts himself when he has doubt about what he said. It's all found there. So this often happens when he's talking to us about a mitzvah. He's explaining to us how it got to be one of the 613. He's also explaining that in this case, it might actually represent two of the 613, one positive and one negative. So some of this is housekeeping, just clarifying how we know which mitzvah it is, or that it is part of the mitzvahs. And then a little bit just to make it clear that this is a kind of overall mitzvah. It does sound like there are separate components to this. Like if I make a neder, I'm supposed to fulfill a neder. If I make a shvua, I'm supposed to fulfill a shvua. He is suggesting that although they are expressed differently, and they are technically two different ways to commit yourself to something, there is one overall mitzvah when it comes to fulfilling what you said that you were going to do. It almost seems silly that the Torah has to tell us to follow through on what it is that we said we're going to do. It seems almost like basic menschlichkeit, just basic goodness to do it. But apparently, it is not to be assumed that just basically good people are always going to do this. Although you could hear people of every culture recommend this as a virtue, always doing what you say you're going to do. There's a specific command to do this here. There's a positive and negative command. You don't always see this with something that we call derech eretz. Derech eretz, in a kind of colloquial way, means just being a good person. There's more to being a good person than smiling. There's certain basic character traits we're expecting from somebody who's called a good person. Basic element of kindness, and this is right up there, in the top couple of things that you would expect, that this is a person who follows through on what they say they're going to do. People who do not follow through on what they're saying they're going to do, it's just that seems to be a basic deficit. We typically say derech eretz kadma Torah, that the Torah doesn't have to regulate basic human kindness or basic human goodness. That basic human goodness is expected of a person even before they approach the Torah, just by being raised by their parents in an environment of, in a good home. There are certain qualities that we expect people to have. And those are not always commanded in the Torah. Every once in a while, there's an exception. It's sort of interesting why an exception is made. So, for instance, it doesn't say in the Torah, it's not one of the 613 mitzvahs to not be angry. Even though we know that anger, and we saw this in the Rambam Shmona Prakim, his introduction to Pirkei Avos, the 8 chapters, how terrible a quality anger is and how far a person should distance himself from anger. But it actually doesn't say, like, don't be angry. It doesn't, there's no mitzvah about being arrogant, even though arrogance, again, it's a very poor quality. Technically, it doesn't say to be joyous every day. There are discussions of joy in the Torah, but it doesn't say you should just go around always being happy. It does say, because you didn't serve God with joy, all sorts of crummy things happen. But there is actually not one of the 613 mitzvahs to be joyous. There is one of the 613 mitzvahs to be joyous on the Yom Tov. That on Yom Tov there's a mitzvah, but not in general. So you have all these.
Rabbi Mendel always says that you should be happy every day.
Right. Right, and it's the Breslover, Reb Nachman of Breslov, mitzvah gedola lios b'simcha tamid. It's a great mitzvah to be happy all the time. It's just not listed as a mitzvah. What they mean is that it's you need to be happy as much as possible. But so you could say, is that a problem that it's not listed as a mitzvah? No, you see this from Reb Chaim Vital and others who say that the Torah doesn't necessarily legislate basic, what we would call basic menschlichkeit, just being a good person. They don't legislate that. There's a kind of expectation that you'll have that. The Torah is there to take that to the next level. But even if you say that, there are some exceptions. Here seems to be one of them. You could say that you can't be a basically good person if you don't follow through on your commitments. That's not a good person. People that don't follow through on their commitments, they're not a good person. They told you they're going to do something and they don't do it. That's not a good person. If you would, some people would consider that towards the very top of the kind of rules of goodness. So that it's sort of interesting to sort of form a list of the mitzvahs that you might say, if that's really true, that this general category of derech eretz, Kodma Torah, comes before Torah, it doesn't need to be legislated by the Torah. If that's the case, then why do we seem to have some mitzvahs that should be on that list? Why do we have some of them listed? And this, to me, this is one of them. If you're going to say you don't need to list basic goodness, then this is basic goodness. Why would you have to list it? There's no culture that thinks that you could be a good person or a great person and not follow through on what you said you're going to do. Maybe there's exceptions, rare exceptions, when you shouldn't have to do it. But for the most part, you would think that you have to do it in every culture.